In Hollywood, secrets don't just disappear, they get managed, renamed, protected by lawyers, studio executives, and carefully worded contracts that understood one simple truth. A star's value wasn't in her humanity, it was in her image. And images don't have complications. They don't have morning sickness, they don't have questions they can't answer. They don't have children the public never knew existed. Marilyn Monroe was photographed countless times during her brief life, every smile catalogued, every curve documented, every public moment frozen in collective memory. But if there was one photograph the world never saw, one moment the flashbulbs never captured, it might be this: Marilyn Monroe, somewhere private, mourning something the world said never happened. And if that story contains even a fragment of truth, then everything we think we know about her tragedy shifts, because her greatest loss might not have been her life. It might have been the life she could never claim. Before the platinum hair, before the breathless voice that made the world lean closer, there was Norma Jeane Mortensen. Born in 1926 Los Angeles, passed between foster homes throughout her childhood. Her mother Gladys flickered in and out of mental institutions, present one month, gone the next, leaving Norma Jeane with a question that would haunt her forever: why don't people stay? Here's what matters about early abandonment. When a child's caregivers repeatedly disappear, the developing brain doesn't learn that love is stable. It learns that love is temporary, always about to end. The amygdala, that internal alarm system, becomes hypervigilant. Every goodbye feels like the final one. Every hello contains the shadow of loss. Norma Jeane grew up in a state of perpetual bracing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. By age 16, she married James Doherty, not because she loved him, but because foster care was ending, and marriage was the only alternative. Love wasn't the point, survival was. So here's what we know for certain. Marilyn's childhood taught her one lesson over and over: that attachment leads to abandonment, that wanting something makes it disappear, and this matters because it reveals the foundation of everything that followed. For Marilyn Monroe, a child wasn't just a dream of motherhood. A child was proof that she could create what she never had, proof that she could build a family that stays. A child represented the one relationship that couldn't walk away, the one bond that biology itself would seal. Now watch what that does to a nervous system, because losing one, if she did, wouldn't just be grief. It would be confirmation of her deepest fear, that she was meant to be alone. The Hollywood studio system of the 1950s wasn't just an entertainment industry. It was a reputation management machine operating with surgical precision. Here's the context that matters. Studio executives didn't see actresses as artists. They saw them as investments, and nothing threatened an investment faster than scandal. The Hays Code didn't just regulate what appeared on screen, it shaped careers, ended them, determined who survived and who disappeared. When complications arose, studios often intervened quietly. Some women took extended rest for exhaustion, some had their situations handled through private arrangements. Some returned to sets thinner, quieter, with gaps in their timeline that official biographies attributed to illness or depression. This wasn't unheard of in that era. Take Loretta Young. She disappeared from the public eye, then later presented a child as adopted. Decades later, it emerged the child was actually hers, with Clark Gable, an image-saving story built for the era. Studios had playbooks for problems. Marilyn entered this system in 1946 as a brunette model with potential. By 1953, she was Marilyn Monroe, the biggest symbol in America, generating millions while earning a fraction of what male stars received. Her body wasn't entirely hers anymore. It belonged to the camera, the audience, the contracts that controlled her public image completely. And when your body is that valuable to that many people, pregnancy isn't just personal, it becomes everyone's problem to solve. Because this isn't about gossip, it's about what a nervous system does in silence. Between the mid-1950s and late 1950s, there are periods in Marilyn's timeline where she appeared less frequently. Some photographs from this era show her in looser clothing. Friends described her as emotionally fragile during specific months. Official biographies attribute these absences to stress, to endometriosis, to studio conflicts, but absence of explanation isn't the same as explanation. In recent years, a story emerged. A woman came forward claiming to be Marilyn Monroe's secret biological daughter, Allegedly born in the mid-1950s and placed for adoption under circumstances the claimant says were kept deliberately opaque. The woman pointed to DNA tests, facial analysis, timeline gaps, childhood memories of being told she was special without explanation. Here's what supporters argue. It explains periods where Marilyn was less visible. It explains emotional fragility documented by friends. It explains why someone so desperate for family never achieved it. They note that making inconvenient situations disappear happened more often than people think in studio-era Hollywood. Here's what critics say. There's no definitive hospital record in public files, no witnesses willing to go on record, no corroborating evidence from Marilyn's documented inner circle. Another unverifiable claim, they argue, another person seeking proximity to mythology. So we're left with two truths at once. Dismissal isn't the same as disproof, and the absence of documentation in a system built to protect reputations doesn't prove nothing happened. It proves the system worked exactly as designed. The DNA tests mentioned were never independently verified. The facial similarities could be coincidental. The timeline gaps exist, but gaps aren't proof. They're just gaps that raise questions. And yet the claim persists. Not because it's proven, but because it's psychologically consistent with everything else we know about Marilyn's internal world. A world where loss was the only constant, and keeping something precious felt more dangerous than losing it. Here's what we need to understand about guilt. When someone who was abandoned as a child faces a situation where they might, even under impossible circumstances, become the one who gives someone away, the psychological impact is devastating. The guilt doesn't just hurt, it becomes an identity. Women who give up children under extreme duress can experience grief that doesn't follow normal stages. It often circles back endlessly to one thought: I became what hurt me. For Marilyn, who'd spent 30 years carrying the wound of being unwanted, that possibility would create a fracture that no amount of therapy or success could repair. Every later miscarriage, and there were documented ones, would feel not like biology's cruelty but like cosmic justice. Imagine a woman leaving a clinic under a different name, signing papers she can barely read through tears, returning to a film set the next week, smiling for cameras, pretending nothing happened. That's not speculation about Marilyn specifically, that's the reality many women faced in that era, and for Marilyn, her body rarely let her forget. So here's what's plausible. If Marilyn faced an impossible choice in secret, the guilt wouldn't operate logically. You can't argue with it, can't rationalize it away. It becomes the lens through which every experience is filtered. Success feels undeserved, happiness feels temporary, love feels like it's based on a lie. Here's the pivot. This would explain patterns that friends noticed, the gravitating toward emotionally unavailable men, not because she enjoyed pain, but because unavailable men confirmed what she already believed, that she wasn't meant to keep anyone. It would explain escalating dependence on medication, not just as sleep aids, but as a way to silence the internal voice that whispered you don't deserve peace, and it would explain the profound loneliness that coexisted with worldwide adoration. Because when you're carrying a secret that contradicts your public image completely, how can you believe anyone's love is real? People who knew Marilyn often remarked on her tenderness with children. On film sets, she'd gravitate toward child actors, speak to them as equals, seem more relaxed in their presence than with adults. Friends noted she collected baby clothes and nursery ideas, even when pregnancy seemed unlikely given her documented health issues. But here's the paradox. Wanting something and trusting yourself to have it safely are not the same thing. For people with disrupted attachment histories, the desire for children exists alongside a terror of repetition. What if I become my mother? What if my instability damages them? What if the pattern doesn't break? Marilyn knew her mother's story intimately. Gladys's mental breakdowns, her inability to care for Norma Jeane, her permanent institutionalization. Marilyn visited her occasionally, but those visits left her shaken for days. She'd inherited Gladys's beauty, her sensitivity, possibly her vulnerabilities, and in the 1950s, before modern understanding of mental illness, the fear of hereditary struggles was profound and paralyzing. A nursery idea scribbled on paper, baby clothes folded in a drawer, and then silence. So the question wasn't just, can I have a child? It was, should I? What if the medication I need harms a baby? What if my emotional state creates another Norma Jeane, another child wondering why their mother can't be stable? What if the safest thing I can do is ensure they never know me at all? This is the trap for people with childhood trauma. Society expects wanting children to be simple, unconflicted, but for those whose own childhoods were painful, the desire and the terror are inseparable. And in 1950s Hollywood, where vulnerability was career suicide, there was no space to voice that ambivalence honestly. One friend later recalled that Marilyn sometimes admitted privately she was terrified of the responsibility, terrified of failing, terrified that wanting something meant it would be taken away, because in her experience, that's what wanting did, it made you vulnerable to loss. Here's what makes a secret loss uniquely devastating. When someone loses a child to death, society provides rituals, funerals, condolences, permission to grieve publicly. The loss is acknowledged, witnessed, shared, but when a child is given away in secret, especially under pressure, there's no ritual, no funeral, no shared mourning, just a return to work, a return to smiling for cameras, a return to being the fantasy while something inside remains shattered. Psychologists call this disenfranchised grief, real but unacknowledged, valid but invisible. And disenfranchised grief is uniquely corrosive because it can't be processed socially, so it processes privately, in the body, in insomnia, in addiction, in symptoms that appear without easy explanation. Marilyn's chronic health issues, her endometriosis, her frequent hospitalizations, all had medical explanations on paper. But trauma researchers now understand something important. Unprocessed loss can show up as insomnia, anxiety, somatic symptoms, sometimes without a clean explanation. And for Marilyn, her body rarely gave her peace, and this is where the story turns. Beyond the physical, there's the psychological haunting. If Marilyn gave away a child, that child would have grown older every year. By 1962, when Marilyn died at 36, a child born in the mid-1950s would have been in early childhood, old enough to talk, to have a personality, to exist somewhere in the world completely unknown to her. Picture a Mother's Day headline while she sits alone in her house. Every child she saw on the street could be that child. Every birthday became a reminder of a birthday she wasn't celebrating. Every holiday was a quiet cruelty. This is the torture of separation you can't discuss. It's not clean, it's not resolved. It's a wound that never closes because you can't grieve what you're not allowed to claim. And for someone like Marilyn, who already struggled with feeling like a ghost in her own life, this would make the unreality complete. She wasn't just playing Marilyn Monroe while Norma Jeane suffered inside. She was playing a woman without complications while something inside her mourned endlessly in silence. So here's where everything connects. When you understand that Marilyn might have carried this specific buried grief, suddenly the pattern of her final years makes devastating sense. Joe DiMaggio loved her, probably genuinely, but he wanted a traditional wife who'd quit Hollywood and give him children. After their brief marriage ended in 1954, Marilyn knew she'd disappointed him. Her next marriage to Arthur Miller began with intellectual intimacy and ended in mutual disillusionment. Miller later wrote about Marilyn with detachment that bordered on coldness, portraying her as someone he tried but failed to save. And then there are the persistent rumors. Press and biographers have long debated Marilyn's associations with powerful figures during this era. Whether those connections were what's been speculated or something else entirely, they share a common feature. They were relationships where Marilyn had no power, no claim, no future. She was the rumor, the risk, the secret kept in the margins. In many photographs from 1962, you can see the exhaustion. For someone who'd possibly given something away to protect careers and reputations, entering relationships where she was once again the thing to be hidden would be a form of self-punishment, a way of saying, I don't deserve to be chosen, I deserve to be a secret. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion. When trauma survivors unconsciously recreate their original wound, it's not masochism. It's the mind's desperate attempt to master unresolved trauma by reenacting it. If I choose abandonment this time, if I control the terms of being disposable, maybe it won't hurt as much, except it always does, and each repetition deepens the original wound. By 1962, Marilyn was barely holding on, fired from Something's Got to Give, isolated from many former friends. Her medication use had progressed into dependency. And in the weeks before her death, multiple people noticed she seemed simultaneously manic and defeated, as if she'd given up on something fundamental. Photographer Bert Stern's last sitting photos from June 1962 capture this perfectly. A woman performing sensuality while her eyes reveal complete exhaustion. She's going through the motions of being Marilyn Monroe while the person inside has already started saying goodbye. Let's separate what we know from what we suspect. Here's what's not in dispute. Marilyn Monroe had a childhood defined by abandonment and instability. She expressed desire for children throughout her adult life. She suffered documented miscarriages. She struggled with mental health and substance dependence. She died alone at 36 under circumstances that remain debated. These are facts. Here's what's claimed but unverified, that she gave birth secretly in the mid to late 1950s, that the child was immediately placed for adoption under extreme secrecy, that studio or legal pressure ensured no documentation survived in accessible public records. These claims lack definitive proof, but here's what's psychologically consistent, that a woman with Marilyn's specific history, facing an inconvenient situation in Hollywood's reputation-obsessed era, might make an impossible choice and then carry its weight silently for the rest of her life, that this ungrievable loss could intensify existing struggles, that it could explain the particular quality of her loneliness, not just alone, but alone in carrying something that invalidated her public persona completely. Whether the secret child claim is literally true, partially true, or symbolically true, it points to the same underlying reality. Marilyn's greatest tragedy wasn't the pills found beside her bed on August 5, 1962. It was the life she never got to live, the stability she never experienced, the family that never stayed, the child she never got to keep, whether that's literal or represents everything she lost along the way. There's a photograph of Marilyn Monroe from 1954. She's sitting alone in a hotel room, staring at nothing. No makeup, no performance, no smile. Just a woman thinking thoughts she'll never share with cameras or journalists or even friends. That photograph haunts me more than any glamour shot, any red carpet moment, any iconic image the world remembers, because in that photograph, she's not Marilyn Monroe, she's Norma Jeane, still waiting for someone to stay. If the claim is true, that child would be in their 60s now. They'd have lived an entire life, possibly had their own children, never knowing their biological mother was the most photographed woman in the world, never knowing that their existence might have been the thing she wanted most and feared most. And maybe that's the real weight of this story. Not whether it's factually verified in every detail, but that the machinery of fame combined with the cruelty of stigma could make a woman choose between a child and survival, that it could corrode her slowly while the world applauded her beauty and never saw her pain. Marilyn Monroe wanted a family. She wanted to be loved. She wanted proof that she wasn't disposable, and whether or not a secret child existed in the literal sense, she died without that proof. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we're forced to hide. Her image survived, her grief didn't.